Today on the Perception and Action podcast, do athletes that suffer from the Yips have different mental imagery than those that do not? How might we conceptualize the Yips from an ecological point of view? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast, back with another article review. In this episode, I want to look at an interesting article that trying to draw a connection between motor imagery, the ability to visualize or image an action in your, and the possibility that's related to the Yips. And in particular, this is in baseball players. So the Yips is something I've covered in previous episode, particularly in episode 137. The Yips is this, some people consider it an extension or extreme form of choking under pressure. It seems to be related to pressure and anxiety, but it's obviously a lot stronger than that. As the authors point out in their article, so this is the article, plus one article, Motor Imagery Ability in Baseball Players with the Throwing Yips. So they talk, there's a motor. It seems to be the main difference between pure choking and the Yips is the Yips seem to involve a motor component, the feeling of tightness, the tremors, jerks, jitters are common in the Yips. The Yips is a very extreme and a much more difficult thing to get rid of than just having struggles under pressure. The Yips is most commonly talked about in terms of golf and golf putting, but it does exist in various other sports, archery, darts, cricket, and the one we're going to talk about today, baseball. In baseball, the most common form is throwing Yips, and here's a few famous examples. Chuck Knobloch with the Yankees. He developed a problem where a ball slowly hit at him. He couldn't throw it to first base, right? So he had all the time in the world, had to make a very, very routine throw, and he would throw it 10 feet over the first baseman's head. The one on the top right is a picture of the Cardinals, Rick Ankiel. Rick Ankiel was a very, very, very dominant, good pitcher, and then he developed the inability to throw strikes and actually hit a lot of batters. And he actually, interesting, he switched to being an outfielder and tried to make a comeback later on with the Cardinals. And the one on the bottom, shown in the GIF, you can sort of see that's Mackie Sasser, a pitcher with the Mets. He developed he couldn't throw the ball back to the catcher, right? He'd have to double clutch it sometimes 3 or 4 times before he could get himself to release the ball back to the pitcher. Right. And this became a huge problem because people would steal on him. Right. They knew that he was going to do this. So the guy on first would run. So these all cases, throwing seems to be the particular problem here. Right. You don't usually get Yips in things as much as in hitting or anything else, but it's actual act of throwing. So in this article, what the authors want to do is draw a possible connection between motor imagery and the Yips. And motor imagery is something I've covered a few times in the podcast. I've talked about it from an ecological point of view in previous episodes. I've talked about using constraints-led approach in imagery and things like that. It's a proven effective technique in motor learning. One of the big things you see is there's a lot of individual differences in ability to perform imagery, how vivid you can image something, how much you can control things in your image, right, where the ball goes, things like that. And this can be assessed through a variety of questionnaires, movement imagery questionnaires. I'm going to show you the one they used in a second that can assess this. And over time, research using this has shown that competitive, higher level athletes have higher scores. They have better imagery ability than non-athletes. And that this can be impaired by a variety of different things, both neurological and injury. So the hypothesis they put forth is maybe there's an impairment in imagery associated with the Yips effective athletes. And they talk about imagery as a possible intervention with Yips athletes with the Yips and how it could possibly help. That's not actually tested in this study, imagery as an intervention. They just want to see if there's any relationship between how they can image. So in this study what they did was looked at 3 different groups of players. They had a control group who had never experienced any problems with Yip. That was 55 players. They had 33 players who were currently struggling with Yip symptoms, and they had 26 players that were recovered from the yips, who had it in the past but were recovered. There was no significant difference in the age group and the playing experience, or what position they played, and so on. Okay, so those are the basic. So very comparable group in a lot of ways. They used the VMIQ2, which is kind of the latest version of the imagery, general motor imagery ability. There's various links. If you just Google that, you should be able to find it if you ever want to use it. It's a 12-item assessment. It's very general. It includes lots of skills like running, jumping, throwing. There is one throwing thing that gets you to image throwing a stone into a pond. So it does have a little bit to do, but it's mostly a general ability. And it gets at both visual imagery, getting you to picture it in your mind, and kinesthetic imagery, getting at how it feels. In their study, they also added some throwing specific imagery. So they had people baseball players try to image throwing the ball to a target. Importantly, they tried to get them both to image good outcomes, positive outcomes, so hitting their target. So they had, for example, they asked, how vividly can you image the following? How clearly can you imagine the visual image in your head that you're throwing a precisely controlled ball toward a target? So that's obviously a positive outcome. And a separate question is, when you imagine the first-person visual image of yourself throwing a ball in your head, do you tend to imagine a negative visual imagery that you will make a wild throw? So this will turn out to be very, very important, separating these two. So this is the basic methodology that they used, and they kind of analyzed. What did they find? So the results of the questionnaire, basically there were two findings. One, on the basic general imagery ability, there was no significant differences in the vividness, the control, the perspective. There was no significant difference between whether it did first person or kinesthetic. There was no significant evidence of differences. Where the differences came is when they started to look at the throwing specific imagery. So when they look at the negative imagery, getting them to imagine missing their target, the vividness of that was much higher in the two Yips group. It was the control group, the score was out of 100 was 24. In the Yips group, it was 73. And then the recovered group, it was 45. So both Yips group were significantly higher than the control group. So they had a more vivid imagery of missing the target, right? They took this even farther by looking at the relationship between the vividability to do of your the vividness of your positive imagery of hitting your target versus the negative imagery of missing. What they found in the control group across the sample, there was a strong negative correlation. That is, people that had more vivid positive image of hitting their target had a very low vividness of the negative image, right? So if you when I got you to imagine throwing your ball, if you had a very, very strong image of hitting the target, you had a very, very weak image of missing the target, right? So you get this relationship. For the Yips group, there was not this relationship at all, right? So people that had strong imagery, positive imagery, did not necessarily, they also had strong negative imagery, right? So that was the basic finding. So the basic finding we're seeing here is that the general motor ability, there doesn't seem to be a difference, whether, as I said, across all the dimensions, but the throwing specific, and particularly when you look at the negative motor imagery, is significantly higher, both in people who are currently suffering from the Yips and those who have experienced it previously, suggesting there is this relationship going on, right? They can more vividly imagine a negative outcome, right? Could lead to a vicious cycle. So they propose, the typical things we talk about when addressing Yips, which don't often very work, as most people try addressing, addressing and handling anxiety better, handling pressure better, things like that. So that, I think this is an interesting finding, an important finding of showing this relationship. What I wanted to do to end is kind of put a ecological view. What is going on with the Yips, right? And I think we can relate this to the concept of negative affordances, right? So if you remember Gibson's definition of affordances, the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes either for good or ill. So most of the time when we talk about sports, we talk about positive, like the affordance for passing or shooting or driving are all positive, right? Affordances for hitting a home run, hitting a base hit. But there's also negative affordances out there, right? So as a pitcher, I have affordance of missing the target completely, having it going all the way to the backstop. Also have the affordance of hitting the batter and seriously injuring them, right? Those are opportunities that are available to me when I throw a ball, right? And so we're getting into, the reason I have that, I think this relates also, we see a similar effect in people recovering from injury and pain, right? For some reason, we're not 100% sure yet, the negative affordances seem to be more inviting than in other people, right? The negative affordance of falling, right? When you are recovering from an image is very, very strong. And that's kind of what you highlight, and you guide your behavior to avoid that, right? And it seems like this is what's happening in the yips, right? The negative affordance of missing your target or hitting a pitcher. What we find if you look at research on baseball pitchers, oftentimes they've had a situation where they lost control of the ball and seriously injured the batter. They hit them in the head or something like that. And that kind of leads to future yips, right? It's this strong, inviting affordance. So a question, is to try to understand why the negative affordance is so inviting. How can we change practice to make other affordances more inviting, like hitting the positive ones? Right. In my book, I talk about the pink envelopes, making affordances more inviting, and some affordances more inviting in practice than others by manipulating the constraints. I think that's the same thing we want to try to do with the yips, right? Tied to decrease the salience of the negative affordance, right? That seems to be what this study is showing. The athletes are overly focused on that. But there's a lot more to do to try to understand this very difficult condition, of course. But I think this is an interesting study showing this effect. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone through St. Louis.